The Lord give you his peace. At the end of our last segment, I mentioned briefly St. Anthony of Padua. We're running out of time, so kind of rush that. But isn't it beautiful to note that the martyrdom of Brother Barato and companions didn't end on a sour note, in the sense where, although they didn't make any converts and they died for Christ, their death was not in vain. It was their blood that brought forth this beautiful flower in the Franciscan life, St. Anthony of Padua, as I mentioned, our first theologian and a wonderful preacher, a saint to whom everybody in every land has a devotion to. It's hard to find a Catholic that doesn't have some type of devotion to St. Anthony, whether it's because they know his powerful intercession and miracles or they lost their keys. Everyone turns to St. Anthony at some point in their life, every good Catholic. So anyway, we move on now. There was what we call the revolt of the vicars that went on. Brother Stephen, a lay brother, he traveled from Italy to Syria to tell Francis that if he was still alive, to return to Italy and save his order. Those two guys that Francis left in charge, what were their names again? Matthew, right? Brother Matthew and Brother Gregory, they were causing all kinds of problems while Francis was away. And this Brother Stephen, he goes in disobedience to find Francis and say, hey, get back home quick. The two vicars in Francis's absence imposed obligations on the friars that were at variance with the rule. Friars who would not bind themselves to these new obligations were driven out of the order, even persecuted by these two. Brother Stephen brought a copy of these constitutions they drew up by a chapter held by these two friars. And there was no questing for meat. They were allowed to eat meat. There was fasting on Mondays. They're introducing all this stuff, making the life tougher, as if they had the authority to do such a thing, especially with the founder still alive. So it was interesting because when Stephen finds them, they're sitting down, Francis is having dinner, and he's actually about to eat meat, and they get these new rules not allowed to eat meat. And so he asked Brother Peter, what should we do? Should we obey the vicars back home, or should we obey the gospel and eat what's set before us? And he says, well, I think we should obey the gospel. He says, good idea, and they cut into their meat. Anyway, some people often joke and say St. Francis loved animals. He thought they were delicious. Anyway, in September of 1220, Francis took Brother Peter, Elias, and Brother Caesar and went back to the Portiuncula and tried to reestablish things and take care of these two wayward friars who were causing havoc. Cardinal Ugolino began to impose a more conventual lifestyle upon the friars. He allowed them to build larger houses with a greater number of friars. And Francis opposed this because it was difficult to observe poverty when you have more than 12, 15 friars living in a friary. And no friar should be admitted to profession with about 1 year of probation. Again, that was a decree that was necessary by the Fourth Lateran Council. But he was imposing more of a monastic observance and these ancient customs on the friars that were not originally there. The disloyalty of the vicars went near to breaking the fraternity. Many friars left the order. Some ministers were driven out. It was a short time of scandal, this whole situation that went on when Francis was in the East. So you see the wisdom of the church telling him, hey, I don't think you should go to the East. And he did, and it caused havoc back home. Before arriving in Assisi on his way back home, Francis went from Venice to Bologna. And in Bologna, he found the friars had built a very large friary there. Brother Peter Staccia, the provincial of Lombardy, and a doctor of law, built it as a house of studies and claimed it as the property of the order. He was also holding a chair of jurisprudence and teaching the friary in the same way he had done in secular life. Francis was not happy with this. These were two great sins in Francis's eyes, continuing his work that he had in the world, and then turning such a large friary, claiming ownership of it and so forth. So Francis had a bit of a meltdown. Francis refused to stay in that convent, and he expelled all the friars from that friary. And as St. Francis returned to Rome, many friars who ran into the mountains to hide from the other two guys came out to find Francis. In Rome, Francis asked the Pope that Cardinal Uligo Ostia be made the cardinal protector. That's what we talked about earlier. In spring of 1220, Ugolino was appointed the cardinal protector of the order. In the spring and summer of 1220, Peter Catani was restored as the vicar of the Portiuncula. So he would have been in charge of that area, and he was restored. Francis was to consider the revision of the rule. And Francis consented to the friars being chaplains to the poor ladies of San Damiano's. So that also happened when Francis gave the friars permission to start serving the sisters there. And then we have in 1221 the beginnings of the Order of Penitents. As we mentioned, this is when Cardinal Ugolino wanted to coordinate and organize all of these penitents who were going about, the confraternity of penitents, to organize them. And so he and Francis wrote a rule that became the rule for the penitents. And then they were entrusted to the friars, and the friars became their chaplains and so forth, their spiritual directors. And they became from then forth known as the Third Order or Secular Franciscans. Later on, the Dominicans will get their secular, so they'll care for and so forth and have their third orders. But it began by all the penitents being given to the care of the friars and the Third Order. Now, in the March of 1221, Brother Peter Catani died. It had to be hard for Francis. He was the first of the early companions to pass away. He was one of Francis's first disciples who stood there and heard the words of the gospel when Francis opened the book 3 times and Peter passed away. So it was very hard on Francis emotionally. And then Elias took his place as vicar, so second in charge of the order under Francis. In September of 1220, there was a papal bull by Pope Honorius III called Cum Secundum Concilium, which forbade the friars to leave the order. That was a papal bull that friars were forbidden to leave the order. You make your vows, you live by your vows, you stay by your vows. You don't run away from your vows because things get tough. You don't run away from your vows because things aren't the way you think they should be. You maintain your vows, you persevere in living the life as given to you. And he said the friars can't wander outside the limits of obedience. You have to maintain holy obedience and go where your superiors send you. And don't go where they don't send you. Now, there's a chapter of 1221 in the rule, and the events, hopefully until 1223, we'll hopefully cover. So Brother Elias of Cortona, let's talk a little bit about Brother Elias. He's pretty infamous in Franciscan life. So he was born at Biviglia. His mother was from Assisi. His father was from Castel Britti. His title of Cortona comes from his place of burial. In the future, Elias will make the Friars Minor a world power. He sent Hemo of Faversham to Nicaea to negotiate the union between the Eastern and Latin Church. He intervened between belligerent Italian parties in the cause of peace. He himself acted as ambassador of Gregory IX in negotiating with Emperor Frederick II. He thrusted the friars into universities and the intellectual world. This is all after Francis's death, I should mention, when he was the superior. So Elias sent and established missions in Muslim territories. He established missions in Georgia, Damascus, Baghdad, Morocco, Tunis, Aleppo. These are all Muslim areas. And here Elias, after the death of Francis, was establishing missions in some of the most dangerous places, and friars were accepted there. Elias studied at the University of Bologna. He studied enough law to become a notary. He was a great preacher with a magnetic personality. He knew how to win people over to himself. He was kind. Here's an interesting quote. Now, this is what they say about Elias. Now, Francis didn't really see this part of him. I think Francis just thought good of everybody. But Elias was kind to those he liked. He crushed those who opposed him and passed over those he was indifferent to. Is that an interesting way to describe somebody? Kind to those he liked, crushed those who opposed him, and passed over those he was indifferent to. He ruthlessly scourged and imprisoned those who protested his policies after Francis's death, even if they were once Francis's close friends. And we can include in that list Brother Leo. Elias developed an uncontrollable temper. When his purposes were thwarted, he pitted himself with violence against those who withstood him. The Pope had to even censure Elias at a certain point. Elias retired into seclusion in the city of Cortona. The people loved him. He was cast out of the order. He was excommunicated from the church because of his dealings with the Pope and the Emperor. He spent his last years building a church in honor of St. Francis, and he's buried in that church. Now, he used to be buried under the floor of the Friars' Choir, and recently they moved his body, thanks be to God, to more of a reverential place. Francis held Elias in high regard. Now, man, all that stuff was after Francis's death. Francis had a high regard for Elias. And Ugolino and Francis may have felt that Elias could bring peace between the fractions in the order. Now, May 30th, 1221, they had the Pentecost chapter. There were 3,000 to 5,000 friars were present, including novices. Ugolino was in northern Italy and could not attend. Sir Cardinal Raniero, governor of the Duchy of Spoleto, presided in Ugolino's place. Francis preached the opening sermon, taking from his text Psalm 143. Listen to this. Blessed be the Lord my God, who trains my hands for battle. Think about that. Here he has this controversy going on in the order, right? You got these brothers who want to change the rule, add all these extra penances and so forth, loosen up poverty and all this other stuff. And Francis is trying to hold to his guns, you know. Friars are trying to build a bigger friary. He's like, no, we're not going to do that. They're trying to get to the universities. Like, no, we're not going to do that. Francis is kind of fighting, you know, with some of the superiors that he himself put in place. And here Francis comes to the chapter, and his opening comments are from Psalm 143, Blessed be the Lord my God, who teaches my hands for battle, trains my hands for the fight, right? So he's going out there to fight, to say, hey, I'm standing my ground. We're not moving on this. And so Francis came to the chapter with the purpose of reasserting the primitive vocation of the fraternity. Francis was not backing down from what God had given to him, no matter how great the opposition was by the superiors that he put in place, that he formed. You know, they turned on that original ideal, and Francis had to stand strong against that. Francis had rewritten the rule for the chapter's approval. And so he had to let me back up and say this. So the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 put out a lot of statutes for religious. And so Francis's rule needed to be updated. So Francis took the 1209 rule and updated his rule in 1221. And in that rule of 1221, he included a lot of things that were not in the original rule that was canonical that had to be there. So at the chapter, Francis presented that rule to the brothers. Now Francis, through Elias, because the saints, he was very sick, Francis, asked who at the chapter would be willing to return to Germany. Remember, they got kicked out because of Yah, which made them say, we heretics, Yah. So they got kicked out. So who wants to go back? So 90 friars volunteered to go. Now we mentioned this. Brother Giordano of Giano stood up to say goodbye to the 90 friars, asking their names so that he might say that he knew martyrs. And he got hooked into going. He was mistaken for a volunteer, so he got sent to Germany. He wrote the Chronicles of the Order, and particularly the founding of the friars in Germany. In his writings, he admits that while he knew Francis when he was alive, he did not consider Francis a saint. He rethought it after the church canonized St. Francis. Just because you're holy doesn't mean people think you're holy. Okay. In 1221 to 1222, Francis is on a preaching tour in southern Italy. And August 1222, Francis preaches in Bologna. Now, I want to briefly take a peek here at the rule of 1221. And then probably our next class we'll look at the reaction to that rule if we can't cover it in this class. So the rule of 1221. Brother Caesar of Spire helped write the rule in adding many scriptural verses. The primitive rule was maintained intact. The rule of 1209 can be found inside the rule of 1221. It was amplified by the addition of certain capitular decrees and papal enactments and by a number of admonitions. So the rule is now broken into 23 chapters, and there are additional precepts contained. For example, on poverty, the friars were forbidden to meddle in the temporal affairs of the novices, or to receive any of their goods except in cases of real necessity. So leave the novices alone. That's a long-standing religious tradition. Leave the novices alone. Don't meddle in novices' affairs. And if a guy's entering, and you don't tell him what to do with his stuff unless he asks, okay? Regarding manual labor, friars were forbidden to be chamberlains or cellars, or overseers in the houses of others. So they couldn't do work inside people's homes and be in charge of their homes, really not being a minor if you're in charge of other people's property. They could not accept employment which would give rise to scandal or be injurious to their souls. So if they were going to go out to work for their food, they'd be very careful that the work they did wasn't going to give scandal, and nor would it be injurious to their souls, putting themselves in occasions of sin. In regards to fraternity, Whoever came to be received into the fraternity, be he friend or foe, thief or robber, is to be received kindly and made welcome. Notice, friend or foe, thief or robber, is to be received kindly. That tells you the kind of clientele that's coming to join the order. You know, people who join the Franciscan order are usually people of extreme, because Franciscans, we don't do anything half measure. If you're going to live the gospel, you're going to give all of yourself. So we're not half measure people. And so if you get somebody who was living a life of sin and converts, and they were full blown in their life of sin, and now they're going to throw themselves full blown in a life of virtue, they're probably going to show up on a Franciscan's door. Regarding the sacraments, they were to confess to a priest of the order if possible. Confess to a brother if they can't get to a priest, and then get absolution from the priest as soon as they could. So they would go to confession right away if they sinned. I should mention this too, that the friars were to avoid seeming sad and gloomy like the hypocrites. They had to keep a joyful disposition. Regarding riding of animals, no brother should ride horseback except in the case of necessity. Remember, riding horseback was a sign of a power, a sign of authority. It meant you had money. But also, if you're riding horseback, you can tend to pass by the people you would normally walk by and talk to. Beasts of burden were not to be kept in places where the friars reside. Now, regarding preaching, no friar was to preach without the approval from his minister. And there were two enactments concerning preaching to the infidels. So the friars who wanted to go among the infidels needed to be examined. Precepts that seem to have arisen out of the problems over the past 2 years were no brother is to receive the vows of any woman. So they couldn't receive women's vows. In other words, a woman could say, well, I want to make private promise, private vows. Okay, I'll hear it. No, you can't receive their vows. That's for somebody else. The ministers are forbidden to assume the title of prior. That was for the Dominicans, and that was for the abbots. You're not a prior. You're not first. You're the least. And so you're not getting the name prior. Twice the rule asserts the liberty of the gospel in regard to the food of the friars. So twice it mentions to eat what's set before you, and the friars have the liberty to eat what's given to them. It says, they may eat all foods which are placed before them according to the gospel. Whensoever necessity shall arise, it is lawful for all the friars, wherever they may be, to eat of all foods that men may eat. So Maitre very strictly said that. So those two guys making all those rules on food, don't listen to them. The new rule says you just eat what's there. Now the treatment of dissident ministers. So they're not bound to obey any nobody was bound to obey any command contrary to our way of life, nor anything sinful. That was important. A friar can never be commanded to do something contrary to the rule, nor something sinful. Couldn't. Francis made it very clear, and that helped friars remain faithful to anybody who was trying to give them a command contrary to the rule. They can sit back and say, I'm sorry, as much as I care about you and love you, brother, I can't obey you because you're telling me to do something contrary to the rule. Of the ministers who walks according to the flesh are to be admonished by the brethren, and if they don't amend, they are to be reported to the general chapter. So very serious there about ministers being observant to the rule and not commanding anything contrary to the rule. Regarding money, it forbade the collection of money, even for certain houses or places. This was reminiscent of the problem of Bologna. The end of the rule reiterates Francis's protest at the preceding chapter. It ends by saying, on the part of Almighty God, I, Brother Francis, strictly command and enjoin that no one take away from these things that are written in this life, or add anything written to it over and above, and that the brethren have no other rule. Francis became very strong that this rule is to be observed. Basta così, that's it. Nobody go contrary to it. We'll see the reaction to the rule in our next segment. May God bless you and may He keep you.